one of my favorite part. Yeah. One of my favorite parts of the webinars because it's just like I love seeing all the markets that people are in.
Yeah, people
135 in Wisconsin. Wow.
from all over.
And also seeing some familiar names. So for a lot of our webinars, we have a bunch of people joining who are members. I see a few names that I recognize on here. And then we also push this a lot into the industry. So we get a lot of people joining who maybe aren't as familiar with Minoan. So I'd love to understand, if you are a member, let us know in the chat. And if you're not, we'd love to understand if you're just here to learn, if you've heard of Minoan, if you're exploring. And then we'll give you guys a few minutes to tell us that, and then we'll jump in. Uh,
And just so I get to join in the fun too, if anyone is already advertising on Furnished Finder, drop that in here, or if you're a short-term rental.
Definitely. Julie's converting. Yeah, we have a few people. We'll go ahead and kick things off. So Jen and Taylor on the Minoan marketing team, both of them are hosts. Jen has rented out one of her properties in Florida on Furnished Finder, and Taylor just found, not just found, I guess this was months ago, found people to stay in her main house for the whole winter, I believe, right? Winter on Furnished Finder. So it's an awesome platform. And Jeff, the CEO, is here. He's gonna tell us a little bit more about Furnish Finder and generally just help all of us understand what is the midterm rental industry about. What are the differences with short-term rental? And I think one thing that's really interesting is the fluidity of being able to think about your property, not just in a short-term lens, or even not just as um, the midterm lens. Like the two can interplay quite nicely together. That's something we've certainly heard um, a lot of. Okay, let me quickly um, go through. Um, yeah, we're gonna get started. All right, perfect. So I'm Mark Kostovsky. I'm the founder and CEO of Minoan. I'm thrilled to be your host for today's session. We have a lot of members on, which warms my heart. It's good to see people are loving the experience, and if you're not, if there are things that are going on that did not meet your expectations, I would love to hear about it because we are obsessed with making sure we're delivering a good experience. My email's at mark@minoan.com, so you can drop me a note anytime. But the reason we're all here, I wanted to introduce today's special guest, Jeff Hurst. Jeff has over a decade of experience in the travel technology industry. He's held leadership roles at HomeAway, Vrbo, Expedia, where he was most recently COO. He spent many years in the short-term rental category and sees massive potential in the growing demand for the midterm rental market. And that was what compelled him to join the team at Furnish Finder. Just a few housekeeping items before we dive in. The chat is open. So if you simply want to react to takeaways, not participate in the chat, that's fine. We will also be having a Q&A towards the end of today's session. So put any questions in the chat as they come up. We're saving time at the end to make sure we can go through those and answer as many as possible. Everyone's muted by default, but please remain muted throughout the presentation, and we will jump right into it. So Jeff, thanks for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you on, and I'll turn it over to you so you can tell the audience a little bit about yourself and the great work you've done at Furnish Finder.
Thank you, Mark, and really appreciative of the Minoan team having invited us to join you and tell you a little bit more about what's happening in the world with monthly rentals. So, as Mark mentioned, I'm Jeff Hurst. I spent almost 13 years at some version of HomeAway, Vrbo, Expedia Group. I joined in 2010 and left in 2023. And I think one of the things that's really exciting about the transition that's happening in real estate and the way people live and travel is kind of this fluidity that's starting to occur between being a short-term rental, maybe a monthly rental, and even a long-term rental. And so as we think about the space, we don't just think about Airbnb and Vrbo, we think a lot about Zillow, and we think a lot about apartments.com and homes.com and the CoStar properties. What you see here is a little bit about my own experience as a short-term rental owner. And so since I was at Vrbo for so long, every few years, I ended up with the good fortune to be able to pick up a property. The one on the far left is our beach house in South Padre. It's on Vrbo and Airbnb. We've got a ranch home outside of Gonzales, Texas, which is a Minoan property. And so it actually has a whole lot of incredible, linens. And I always get a ton of compliments when my family's out there on the public goods, bath products, and coffee, and all the stuff that we keep stocked. And so that has been very cool for the family. It's probably the family's favorite place. And then we have a place on Lake LBJ, which is on Furnished Finder now. And so we're trying to, I'm personally using it to try and figure out like where are the gaps and opportunities between short-term and monthly rentals. And so these have been phenomenal for the family and have helped me get a better insight into, how people use our products and what the opportunities are. They're also a big source of how I help people understand the difference between short-term, mid-term, and these categories. And so on one end, think about there being Airbnb, VRBO, Booking.com, average length of stays, less than 7 days. It's typically around 3 to 4 days. It's typically a leisure trip. And maybe the, average nightly price is somewhere around 250 or $300. People make a lot of their money having larger format homes and hosting, larger group events. So each of the properties I own is more than 4 bedrooms and is kind of catering to multiple families traveling together. On the long-term side, you've got that Zillow, you've got apartments.com, homes.com, you've got realtor.com. And the use case is really around I'm finding a place to live, for years or in the sale, potentially forever. They have a big rental pool, but it's almost always unfurnished. And in the middle, you've got us. And so we overlap a little bit with Airbnb, probably the most. We overlap some with Zillow and apartments.com, a little bit less. But the majority of homes on our site are exclusive to our site. And so people use us basically just to find high quality monthly tenants. And you can see here the majority of our tenants are business travelers. We were really kind of a business that boomed during COVID because it was founded around travel nurses. And during the pandemic, there were travel nurses moving everywhere, and we became a go-to site to help facilitate that dynamic. Additionally, what we've seen the most growth in recently has actually been people who are relocating or dislocated. And so that's often someone's moving from Seattle to Austin, as some friends of mine recently did, and they need a place to stay for 3 months while they find a long-term home. Or potentially they just decide that they don't want to screw with furniture and everything yet, and they want to live in 2 or 3 different neighborhoods before they decide. And they might live in furnished finders for 3 months at a time and figure out how they're going to settle in and where they're going to end up. This is also where a lot of insurance claims, remodels, if you're building a house and it overruns, you might need a place to stay. That happened to my family. And Furnished Finder is a great solution for that. And so we're typically not on lakes, rivers, mountains, beaches. We're more typically close to commuter corridors, schools, major employers, and the footprints more frequently kind of 2 bedroom or less. It's more of a business traveler, someone who's there in addition to their house, or it's a family that's displaced, in which case you might be 2 to 4 bedroom. And what's most unique about the model, for any of you who've been in short-term rentals a long time, it feels like, Vrbo in 2008. And so it's a annual subscription where you pay $179 a year, and we are lead gen. We let you get paid how you want to get paid. We let you talk to guests how you want to get talk to guests. Your phone number's available. We're not screening anything. And the idea is that, the process actually has more in common with a long-term rental. There's tenant screenings, there's actual leases, and most people are getting paid with check or ACH, 5 to 10 days before the rent is due. And so it's not really Airbnb-able in our minds. And the reason tenants choose us is because if you're, a traveling nurse and maybe you make 90 to $100,000 a year, booking on Furnish Finder for your 3 travel gigs a year saves you over a week's take-home pay. And so you've got a lot of incentive to not pay Airbnb fees of 10% or more every time you do one of these bookings. And so people are increasingly coming to Furnish Finder to avoid paying the big platform fees. And our commitment is to stay lean and stay open to basically help people do just that. Um, so when you think about, who's searching the category, I think something important to understand, a lot of influencers will refer to it as midterm rentals. Tenants don't think of it that way. They search for monthly rentals, month to month, monthly, sublet. That's where kind of the category term is. But the most searched thing is actually Furnished Finder. And so people are coming to Furnished Finder for this specific use case. And that's how we've, have 300,000 homes and are growing our tenant base over 40% year on year. The experience on the short-term sites, you can see they have monthly products, but it's really catered around how do you serve this short-term use case. So in the Vrbo example, it's like, are you traveling for a few days? Are you traveling for a few weeks? The last option is a month. Similarly with Airbnb, the last option is a month. And so there is a use case there, but what we've learned a lot recently is that a lot of hosts really prefer not to be getting paid month to month by Airbnb and all the travelers' funds tied up. They would rather have that be with them, and they certainly don't want to see, if it's a average rental for us would be about 3 months. It might be $2,500 a month. You're going to pay over $700, maybe $800 in Airbnb fees for the privilege of getting that booking. And as opposed to $179 for 3 to 4 bookings on our site through the year. The experience on the long-term players, you can see here a few examples. It's kind of like 2 of the 50 filters. So Zillow does have a filter for accept short-term leases. Zillow does have a filter for furnished. But once you start selecting those, you're usually looking at 2 or 3% of the inventory in a city. And so it's really not that meaningful. And when you look at the overall portfolio of inventory, apartments.com has about 80,000 in the US, furnished rentals available for less than a year. That's 95% multifamily. Think of this as like the big box, 400 units that's, near an urban center, in Austin, it's a Gables or it's managed by RPM or one of these, Graystar. These are huge complexes. Zillow has about 30,000 units, and about 2/3 of that is multifamily. Furnish Finder's commitment is basically we serve individual landlords. And so, the average landlord on our site has about 1.2, 1.3 properties. We're not doing business with the big multi-listing conglomerates. We're doing listings with individual landlords because we think they provide better value and are frankly pretty underserved in each of these platforms. And so that's where we get most of our growth. And I think why tenants increasingly choose us is that there's better value there. And there's really a different type of experience versus checking into someone who's managing 3, 4, 500,000 units across the US. And then, kind of what's happening growth wise, the short-term rental industry has clearly been affected a lot by regulations. And it's also coming off a really peak period when people were, choosing vastly in 2021, 22, the preference of private homes for, safety reasons or getting out of cities during the pandemic. In the most recent Airbnb earnings report, they mentioned that they're growing, they call it mid-single digits in the US. And so the total bookings is growing, somewhere around 5%. We're not a bookings platform, so I don't know exactly how fast bookings are growing for our landlords, but our tenant demand is growing over 30% year on year. And so tenants are flocking to us for this monthly use case. And what you're also seeing in that is that increasingly that our inventory is becoming more available in more rural suburban locations than it has been in the past. And so, one of the top cities for us this year is Abilene. Abilene's where OpenAI is building their data center with Oracle. And so there's just not enough housing. And you see a lot of that with data centers. You see a lot of that with people doing big power projects or where industries relocating is that the construction workers need to be there for 6 months and there's not enough housing, or they choose not to stay in, what would be our hotel competitor, which is like an extended stay America. An extended stay America's nightly rate might be a little over $100 a night. So you're paying, $3,000, $3,500 a month for that studio versus maybe a 800 or 1,000 square foot with a full kitchen and a private bedroom on Furnished Finder. And so, we see this as an opportunity to boom because of macroeconomic trends and also because regulations have really tamped down Airbnb's opportunity. And Airbnb is also getting a lot more aggressive with their own policies in terms of how they're treating hosts. Having been president of Vrbo, like my take on this is Airbnb is actually oversupplied. And when you're oversupplied and with their stock trading where it is, they're really focused on monetization. And so some policies they announced last week, it's kind of a redefinition or tightening of what they've said before, is that you're not allowed to try and take guests off platform. I think that makes sense. You're not allowed to encourage repeat guests to book directly with you. That's a pretty big shift in terms of how marketing platforms have worked. Usually OTAs are thought more of as customer acquisition. And so, they're talking, and you can read these on their website, about all of the different use cases you cannot interact with guests on, including technologies you have in your own house, such as a lock that requires them to register or log in to access your home. They want all of that to go through Airbnb. Our position is this is your house. You pay us a marketing fee, we let you manage it however you want to manage it. We might encourage tools to help us understand how you're doing or give tips, but it's not nearly the same police state that we're observing with what Airbnb is doing. What else? A little bit more about our tenants. I think something worth knowing is that the people really affiliate us with Travel Nurse Housing. We actually own a website called travelnursehousing.com. But the things that are growing fastest are business, and we include digital nomads in here. It's relocations. Academic is a really big use case. Think about traveling professors and grad students. We don't really have the inventory or aren't looking to have the inventory for undergrads, but that, traveling professor or someone who's doing their residency for a doctorate, they really need housing like we have, and they often have families, and they, don't want to move the furniture or aren't in a place to afford furniture yet. And so the dynamic, if you're moving from long term, is really like, what's your return on furniture? If you can spend $7 a square foot, which is about what we hear from our landlords to furnish your home, let's say you've got 1,000 square foot home for $7,000, you can pay that back really fast, because we see that our landlords earn 50 to 100% more in rent than having an unfurnished property. And they typically have occupancy that's, north of 90%. And as a little bit of evidence of kind of how this shakes out, this is our average rental rate across the US. And so all sorts of variability in here. But if you've got a 2-bedroom home, you're doing about $2,600 a month in Furnished Finder rent. I think I saw Zillow publish some stuff last month. Their 2-bedroom average rent in the US is closer to 2,000, I think a little under. And so there's, it kind of speaks to the premium you have. And then you really think about that as you're going to do 2 extra turns a year, maybe 3, and you're going to pay for furniture. And that furniture might have a lifespan of 2, 3, 4, maybe even 5 years or longer, depending on what fit out and quality you use. And so that's how you turn these into real cash engines, is that the payback on furniture is something that's like the gift that keeps on giving for the midterm category. It's important to note on this that we don't really expect these to be furnished like short-term rentals. These aren't pickleball courts and lazy rivers and 70-inch flat screens in every room. It's typically somebody who's there to work, coming home and wants to be comfortable, cook a meal, or it's somebody whose home just burned down and they're thrilled to be able to stay in the same commuting pattern and not really looking for luxury so much as comfort. And so there is an opportunity to, especially if you're coming from short term, really surprise and delight with the fit out you may have achieved through Minoan or looking at Minoan, which is different than starting from scratch. You can actually spend less than if you were going to furnish a short-term rental. Lastly, some things of what's around the corner for monthly rentals. I'd highlight that I think we're in a period because of inflation, the potential for mortgage rates to be going up, and in general, an housing and affordability crisis, that you're going to see more people live this way. And so it's been kind of fascinating for me, having come from short-term rentals, how many of our tenants don't have a primary residence. They live in a furnished finder for 6 months or 12 months, then they move and get another one for 6 months. Sometimes your 3-month rental becomes a 15-month rental. And really the cash outlay for furniture and the commitment or uncertainty around your job is a huge part of that. And so I think you're going to end up seeing that Airbnb market and that Zillow market really converge into this. in a manner that creates some really interesting and sustainable opportunities for property investors and property managers to get ahead of this. This feels like 2008 to me in the short-term rental market, where Airbnb was just founded. There's a crisis unfolding in terms of real estate and affordability, and people start to flock to this value. And also, homeowners start to open up other use cases to get basically more income out of a property that was either under monetized or not monetized at all. I think we're going to play a role similar to that in this next stretch. And we are starting to see more inventory come on, more people from Airbnb explore, as evidenced by conversations like this. And you'll see, kind of city centers start to redefine a little bit. And I don't think it's going to have the same friction as the last time, because so much of the Airbnb Vrbo dynamic was not in my backyard. I don't want one of these homes next to where I live because I don't want someone there every other weekend partying, going to Sixth Street, having one of these in Nashville. This is a lot more of a community asset. And so if you've got friends who are building a house and they're trying to stay in the neighborhood, you're thrilled for them to rent this house in your neighborhood. If you've got people moving to your neighborhood, it's a great asset for realtors to be able to, like, hey, live here, explore before you buy. And then finally, if you've got someone whose, roof gets damaged or there's a fire or flood, it's a community service that they don't have to move, 6 miles away into overpriced big box furnished housing or a hotel. They can stay in the neighborhood and their kids can keep playing with your kids. And like, I think that part is going to have the evolution of this feel very different than what happened from 8 to 15, which was a boom in its own right, but is replicable in a different manner for midterm rentals and monthly rentals. Um, Mark's going to share a little bit about how they see the category, and then I would love to take a ton of questions and open up the conversation.
Perfect. Thanks, Jeff. Um, do we have another slide on the matrix in here? Oh, perfect. Okay, so many of you may be familiar with this graphic, the Minoan matrix. It's sort of a guide to think about where to invest your dollars when furnishing a short-term rental. And I'll summarize it at a very high level. Where you get high aesthetic value, so that's the y-axis, and high functional value. We call this the quality quadrant, the top right. It's really where anyone's sitting, sleeping, or eating. That's sort of like where the dollar, it's worth spending money. This is also true for monthly rentals, but one thing that I've seen many people considering moving from short term to midterm. We have teammates who do short term and have moved some of these to midterm. There are few things that that people may not invest in necessarily when it's a short term rental that are important to get right for a monthly rental, and I'll just talk through a few of those. One is a lot of the stuff in the kitchen. So, short-term rentals, also called vacation rentals, right? I mean, most Vrbo, it all comes from this idea of being on vacation. People generally are not as interested as cooking or using these appliances when on vacation. And so we certainly see a lot of hosts. We see hosts who do invest in the kitchen, but we see a lot of hosts who are really like, that's not where I want my dollars to go, in these appliances and plates and forks and all this stuff. If you are considering monthly rentals, for sure, that stuff in the kitchen is going to be used. And so just making sure that it's an acceptable standard and something that um, you would be comfortable using in your home is really important to consider. And then the other things are around the bedding. And think about the bedding. There's a difference between sleeping on a mattress for 3, 4 days and sleeping on a mattress for 3 or 4 months. And so a lot of short-term rental hosts are doing this already, but stick going towards more of a hybrid, where you have a mix of coils and foam is always going to be the safest bet. It's the easiest for any body to adjust to. The reality is your body adjusts to any mattress over time. So that's why these mattress companies, like when they're selling to consumers, it's like a 90-day sleep trial. It's because after 90 days, they're kind of betting your body's just going to like adjust to it and they're not going to have to deal with the return. Um, but these hybrid mattresses are going to minimize discomfort from anyone who's coming from any other mattress. If you go for 100% memory foam, you can save on costs. but you might get some complaints. And then, if you don't necessarily need to go up luxury. I mean, Minoan, we're big in like we sell like luxury king mattresses for under $500. So we don't think you should ever spend more than that. But just be conscious of um,
And
those
you know,
things.
something I'd point out there, Mark, that's I found it was sort of true at Vrbo. It's way more true here. King beds. And so we
Yeah,
actually have a king bed filter, which isn't a common filter on Airbnb or Vrbo. They'll tell you the bedding, but you can't search by it. We actually let people search by it because it's such a common request for, average number of tenants has been right around two. And, they just want that extra space. And one of the most important things for this use case is sleep. you know, invest a little bit more in bedding, invest a little bit more in the bed, but like it's worth kind of having smaller nightstands and maybe not the perfect design experience to get the king bed in a room that's a little bit more crammed than it is to go with a queen or a full and have it staged better because the functionality really matters for this use case.
totally. And you mentioned this already, but in the short-term rental market, a lot of there's a big strategy around selling like pizzazz and pop, and so you see a lot of amenitization and super amenities and these things that certainly make sense for a short time. Novelty is nice when you're going to be there for 3 or 4 days. It's exciting. When you start thinking about staying somewhere for 3, 4 months, you view it a little bit differently. And I think everyone can relate to that. And so you can do this with your own property, look at it and think about it with that lens of, okay, if someone's coming here for months, what things would annoy them? What's worth solving for? What things maybe don't matter as much.
And
Um,
another thing to think about with your property portfolio in this dynamic is you're buying a different type of property. And so, what I've seen, my personal experience with short-term rentals, but also the Vrbo lived experience for me, a lot of what you're paying for in the real estate is a vanity premium. You're paying to be closer to the mountain. You're competing with people who might be buying a second home that's not a rental. And so, more of the economics is either a tax benefit or it's betting on the appreciation of the asset. Midterm rentals, in my experience, is a way better cash on cash performance. And part of that's because a lot of what you're looking to buy here might be a duplex that's got two-bedroom units in a good commuter part of town, but you can do that for $400,000 to get both units instead of maybe spending 400 or $500,000 for a single two bath that's 3 blocks off the beach or something. And so the reliability of the cash and the very different entry price has been very interesting for, I think, investors. And a lot of people actually, I think more so than short term, arbitrage these. They'll take out a 3-year lease and then they'll agree with the master landlord that they're going to furnished rent it monthly and they won't do anything less than a month. But then they'll make the spread between, that 3-year unfurnished lease, buying furniture, and then doing it themselves. And that's been a very lucrative model for several people on our team, but a lot of people in the category.
yeah, I have a question on that. We got a few. I've been trying to scroll through and see the questions people are asking. I haven't caught them all, but there's a few around a few different categories I've seen, but one of them is about pricing. And so how to think about pricing. And it's interesting when you were pulling up business travelers and then like insurance relocation, what stuck out to me is I'm like, those are people who potentially aren't on the hook for the bill. And I know for those of you who we have some friends who have been evangelizing midterm rentals for a while. Jesse Vasquez, who's I think doing a conference next month that people should check out if they're interested. I think Furnish Finder Jeff, you'll be presenting there. And then Ruben Kanya is another one. I remember Ruben, he's been focusing his strategy mainly around insurance, partnering with insurance agencies for relocation. And what he was saying is he's like, yeah, these insurance companies, like they'll pay way more than they're not as price sensitive. So I'd love Jeff to understand, like, yeah, how does the elasticity or price sensitivity work in this category? And is there situations where you can get away a little bit with a little bit higher rate if a business is covering it or for insurance companies covering it?
Yeah, I think like any marketplace or any, whether it's real estate or consumer business, you just need to know who your target customer is. And so if your target customer is insurance, then you've got to be willing to maybe have more laps in your calendar because you're typically waiting for events or something that might cause more demand in your area. And you might make more rate, in a given month, but you might actually lose occupancy over the course of the year. Lots of people have that as a strategy. And, one of our top searchers on our side is ALE, which is a large placement agency. Several, I'd say a ton of people cater just to travel nurses. They've got blackout shades. They outfit it with exactly what they expect, that travel use case to need. And then some people are more looking for business. You can find scenarios where people are reaching two or three types of tenants. It'd be really rare to be reaching four or five of the different tenant types, to have the right place for an academic, a travel nurse, a business traveler, and a relocating family. It's just unlikely. And so you need to be choiceful about who you're competing with. And then I always encourage people to start with, you've kind of got a few competitive sets. One is, what's it look like for that tenant type to shop on Airbnb? Right off the bat, you've got a chance to make more money because we don't charge platform fees. But you'd compare similar houses on Airbnb or Vrbo and what they're charging. Secondly, think about like, what's the hotel alternative? Is your house more like, do you have a studio that feels more like an extended stay America? You want to price at or slightly potentially below that value, but that's like a decent benchmark. Or does it feel more like, JW Marriott, or does it feel like an Embassy Suites? And use that as a frame of reference. And then lastly, I think you're looking at the long-term market and what are, two-bedroom unfurnished condos or single families renting for on Zillow. And you want to be at a premium to that because you're providing, basically more service via furniture. I don't think there's a we are looking at building a tool or partnering with players who do for how to price this. Most of the pricing tools out there are really focused on that short-term rental use case. And you should expect that it's a lower nightly rate because you're going to have higher occupancy if you're going with a monthly strategy.
Another question that I've seen come up a few times is this idea of like switching between short term and midterm. Maybe some, like someone had said, they want to keep it as a, Vrbo for high season, but then put in on Furnish Finder for the off months. I know that's Taylor's place in Maine. She rented out in the winter, which is not, not a high season for Maine. And so I think in that, can people flex across? And then a lot of questions around the coordination of making sure everything's in sync and that systems are speaking to each other and that, you're not accidentally selling a month-long rental if you have a short-term rental in the middle of the month. That's something I saw pop up a few times.
Yeah, I saw someone also reference kind of the site experience. And so, I've been here a year and a half. It has been entirely an exercise in rebuilding the site from the ground up. We've got a long way to go, but we've, basically redone homepage, search experience, property details page. We're investing next in messaging and onboarding. And along with that, owner tools and most notably calendar. So we now import your Airbnb or Vrbo calendar to Furnished Finder to help avoid double bookings. And we also have a more searchable calendar experience. It used to feel more like Zillow or apartments.com. There's not a calendar there. There's just a unit available for rent. You have no idea when it's available for rent or if it's still available for rent. And so we're kind of in that middle ground where you can import calendars and help to prevent the double bookings. We're also an inquiry model. So you're only accepting a booking on our platform if you tell someone you're accepting it. And so that also prevents double bookings with Airbnb because you've got that last look at, oh, let me go be sure this is still unbooked on Airbnb or Vrbo, or do I need to move something around? What I'd say about the hybrid strategy is twofold. The most successful landlords on our site take one booking at a time. And that's because the majority of bookings actually extend. And so you've got to, someone tells you, I need the place for 4 months. I'm positive my house remodel is going to be done in 4 months. The guy's given me his word stronger than oak, and it takes 3 more months. They want to stay in your house. It's going to extend. It's a good rate. And so you usually don't want to be interrupting that. And so typically people will have a month's notice for when move out is, and the lease up process is less than 30 days. And so, landlords who are, it's a little more work, but the landlords who are working at it typically have a few days of vacancy, not weeks or months, when they're, hustling to find the next tenant to replace someone who's moving out. And so that's point one, is the calendar is a little bit more one at a time. The hybrid strategy I see most, Michigan's the example I often give. I think Maine is a good one. Michigan is a short-term rental market in the summer, and it's a pretty dead short-term market in the winter. And so what you see is people will convert these and literally completely block, the Airbnb calendar for anything less than a month, and then move to a midterm strategy. And when they're doing that, they're trying to find someone for 3 or 4 months who's maybe at a construction gig or university or whatever, travel nurse housing at a lower rate. But it does help, keep the place occupied, keep all the bills paid. And, it's actually can be a service just to have someone in one of these houses in the winter. And so I think that's the right way to think about it, is like somewhere as you get into shoulder and off peak, you might transition. But it really works best when that transition moment is not still a short-term market, or there's a use case that could be exciting for you, whether it's construction, academia, or business. Like my beach place in South Padre, there will never be a business use case for it. That's just not what it is. There could be a digital nomad use case for it in the winter, and that's the type of things we're playing around with.
Totally. And I imagine the things people are looking for, desks, work from home stations, all that stuff becomes really important. I'll pull up another. By the way, love the questions. We're trying to go through, catch as many as we can, but if you asked a question a while ago and we haven't, and you think we may have missed it, feel free to just copy and paste and bring it back to the top because we want to answer as many as possible. I saw two questions I thought were interesting and related. One's around restocking consumables a multi-month stay, which I can comment on what we hear from folks, and the other one's around cleanings and think about cleanings, which I'm less familiar with. So I'll
Yep.
ask you to answer that one, Jeff. But I think that there's an interesting, this idea of like turns. There's so many turns in the short-term rental side. And on the monthlies, like the things you do around turns are actually less. There's less. And so let me answer that from the consumable side. Generally, what we hear as best practice is to make sure that the property is stocked when the guests first get there. And there's a book called Moments That Matter, which you don't have to read because I'm going to summarize it for you right now. Basically, people are mostly remember the very beginning of an experience, the very end of an experience, and then a peak and a valley in the middle. So the beginning of the experience is quite important. And so having someone show up and then feel like, oh my gosh, they don't even have dish soap, in that way, I think it's similar to thinking about the short-term rental. So we see a lot of people who will stock, the monthly stay with like maybe a couple weeks worth of supplies, not enough for the whole stay, but enough to make them enough time for them to get settled and get comfortable. And then you don't have to replenish after that. Then it's on the tenants to go out and buy the toilet paper, buy the soap and shampoo, and do a lot of stuff because it's more closer to a home, at that point, which is nice. But we do see a lot of hosts who they want to make that initial stay feel nice, so they might put in like a nice package or nicer amenities to start, and then they let the tenants replenish. And then on cleaning, I would imagine that's on them as well. But Jeff, I don't know, what do you see in the market?
Yeah, I agree with you on the consumables. We call it a starter kit. You want a starter kit so that when they get there, they don't have to run to CVS or HEB or place an order. I think the longer the starter kit, the better. It is kind of a surprise delight moment. And then, you think about things more like, if the iron breaks, how do I get one there quickly? There's a handful of things that if they, you don't really think about them being a disposable in a short-term rental because people aren't ironing there, but people are ironing, if they're there for work. And so there's a handful of things like that. We frequently hear that, a lot of these guests actually leave the home with more things than they showed up with, that they will have added cookware or added a better iron or ironing board. And so they kind of evolve and kind of move to suit needs. I think one of the things that's important and really available with this tenant type is it's not a family that just booked it is going to show up and assume it's okay. Like many of them have done a video walkthrough with you. They've all talked to you on the phone. And so there is a chance to just set expectations. Hey, I provide these things before you get there. Is there anything else you'd like me to have there when you arrive? Or be sure you have on your own. So I think that's one point. On the cleaning side, overwhelmingly, it needs to be really clean when they get there. And when they leave, you need to expect to really clean it again. There are some tenant types that will ask, hey, could I use your cleaning service weekly or monthly? And you just, price it for them, and it's a chance to maybe make some margin. But in general, you treat it more as your annual deep clean in a short-term rental that you're doing 4 times a year. as opposed to like a clean and a turn that you might be doing every week or every 3 or 4 days in short term.
Yeah, super interesting. One other question that's popped up in different flavors in here that there's a few questions around like competitors, who are competitors. So there's one that was like, I saw a mention of June Homes, I saw a mention of Landing, and then I just saw one about Airbnb. I'm gonna lose it now. Airbnb doing a partnership of some sort that seems like it's very focused on the monthly space. You've already talked about sort of the market broadly, but just sort of curious, I guess. Yeah, I guess the two new ones, June Homes or Landing. I don't know how you view the industry, how you guys all play
You
in.
June and Landing are both customers, so you can see, some, I don't think all, but most, some of their inventory on our side. You kind of, I compare June and Landing to being like, they're a property manager. They are functionally similar to, I think they're the midterm version of what Sonder was originally doing, but now they're not in the lease up phase. But they provide a level of service experience that feels a little bit more like a property managed, professionally property managed short-term rental. And they work with us to find tenants and advertise on our site. You would expect them to be more of a commission type of model. And so when you're rented, they're going to keep their X% and pay you Y%. And that's why, our focus on the independents is more the independents are more likely to pay us $179 a year and kind of, for rent by owner, do it themselves for a lot of these use cases. It is, I think, overwhelmingly likely that there will be a new breed of property manager that comes to be in the next, 2 to 4 years that has a model that is this bridge between single family residential long term, typically managed by kind of realtors or realtors' offices, and vacation rentals. Because vacation rentals, they're charging 25 to 30%, they're yielding closer to 40 or 50% of the total rent. On the long term side, that number is usually more like 10%. And for an extra 2 or 3 turns a year, you can charge maybe 15% and make 50 to 100% more monthly rent. There's a real use case there. And I think that you'll start to see this category professionalize. And as it does, I think you'll start to see our services open up to better service. I saw some questions around what's our API capability? Who do we connect to? The short answer now is we don't. But eventually, I do think we'll end up connecting with more of the Yardies or Appfolios or the Hostfulies or Guesties to figure out how to better serve the professionals. But in this exact moment, it hasn't been a priority because we're really refining and getting the independence right first. On the Airbnb topic, Mark, they've been in and out of a lot of partnerships over the years that are basically a way to get regulatory buy-in with HOAs, where they'll do a deal with a building or a large developer that gives them access to inventory and cuts the developer in on the economics. We had one of those when I was at Vrbo. They would, I'd say it would be exceedingly unlikely something that's exclusive to Airbnb and a partnership like that would show up on our side. But that's the economic model that's there, is it's more of a large player platform.
Interesting. One thing I've seen touched on once or twice is this commentary around like ADRs and you touched on the averages, which are really interesting to look at, especially you have to think like that's net of there's no take, there's no service fees on top of that. So if you're doing a comparison to like Airbnb, you actually have to gross that up a little bit. But a lot of our, we have a lot of Minoan members on the line. Generally, the folks who sign up for a Minoan account and use Minoan are quite thoughtful about the design of the property. Thinking about all the details from wallpaper, making these like properties on the, I would say, higher end of the ADR range. And so I saw a few questions about, what does the category look like there? I would love to understand, yeah, your perspective on what does the high end look like there? How does it perform? Any insights?
Yeah. I think the one, in general, the category thinks in terms of months. If I were going to pick a hotel style or OTA style metric, I'd actually pick ARPU probably more than I would ADR, because ADR can be really misleading when in a monthly you're rented 30 months out of the month. Whereas
Totally.
short-term rental, you're probably rented, maybe 20 days would be pretty good performance. I've got a rental in the summer that rents for $1,600 a night. but it doesn't ADR $1,600 a night. Uh,
Mm.
and so that, that's the dynamic to think through. The luxury side for monthly is, it's a smaller use case. And when you think about our tenant types, there's a subset of business, which is a traveling executive or even executive with their family who's choosing to be in this house instead of a JW Marriott or a Four Seasons. And so they do have a lot of disposable income. That's frequently a relocating executive, but it could be a traveling executive. So there's a small use case there. And then the relocating family is a pretty big use case. If you're building a 6-bedroom house and it's in, go pick your affluent neighborhood and you need a place to stay while it's being built, you're hoping to rent a luxury home for that stay. If you've got a place with water damage or your roof burns down, similar story. The insurance coverages typically follow the value of the home. And so there's more disposable income. So I'd probably refer back to my earlier comment around who are you targeting and what do you think their disposable income is, and then being sure there's enough of them there. And so we are working on data products to help you better understand in a certain zip code how many of the tenants are academics versus travel nurses versus relocating, dislocating, or business. We're building the data set now, but we haven't made it available to customers yet.
I'm gonna answer, or I'm gonna ask this question. Tracy's had a few, and I haven't had a chance to get to them. So Tracy, I'll make sure we get this one answered here. Is there any way you can add each unit of a house on the profile page? We'd like potential renters to see each unit on the profile page. Right now, they only see one of the units. That's where I like to send people if they want to see all my properties. So sounds like a UX. You mentioned there's a comment around the site getting an overhaul, looking much nicer. You also spoke to like future PMS integrations, different functionality. So it sounds like a UX thing. Would be curious to see if that functionality is supported, but then also maybe just understand what is the functionality if you can give us a sneak peek to the roadmap, what are the things you really want to enhance and improve on the site?
Uh, as always, feedback's a gift and we appreciate it. I think on this one, there's some pretty well understood patterns we'll follow. And so there's a pattern, complexes has a pattern that's very common in long-term players where you can see the building and then click through the units below it. Short-term typically has a pattern where you might have a casita next to a house and they link to each other in a listing. We haven't built it yet in a way that I'm excited about. And so, it's something that we'll refine. When I think about where the site's headed, the biggest things that I think will move the needle from a tenant perspective, we're probably a couple months away from relaunching the app completely and having that be a modern experience with more modern app. Towards the end of the year, we'll redo messaging. And so messaging will start to feel more like WhatsApp, where you can have a much more robust experience. It can follow you across devices. And we can also do things that are really common in short term, like help the tenant understand response times and help the tenant understand availability based on some of the messages. Our biggest challenge today is actually being sure we keep the calendars accurate. And so we've built a product there, but we need to connect with more APIs, more software tools, because increasingly that's the way landlords and hosts manage their properties. And so that'll be the next evolution will be on the onboarding side. I think Airbnb built a great product, and I think that we'll start to build an onboarding experience that feels more like that. Because we're building it now, we've got probably a little more opportunity to have AI built natively into it to help write your description, to help think about pricing. And, I'm optimistic we'll be able to do some of that. But, my vision for it is that, maybe we're slightly less convenient than Airbnb, but you save a ton of money. And everyone's like, of course I'm going to put in that next 20 minutes because I'm going to save $700. And then we're way more convenient than Zillow or CoStar, apartments.com, homes.com, because we've got calendar and we've got messaging and it's built for this use case of I'm going to be there in 3 weeks and want to ask questions. And so that's what we're building towards. And, but I don't think there's not something as I talk to the team of like, hey, we're going to wow the world with this thing. It's much more like we're going to build this product in a way that users expect it to work and add a handful of things that delight them at a price that's unbelievably low. And that's where we're headed.
Yeah, there's so many benefits. You've the fees is a big one, but also just the reliability. the reliability of having a tenant in there for longer periods of time, more likely to treat it like a home. Not you never, people are different, but generally I certainly hear people cite that as a reason, as like people treat it more like a home. They're there for longer periods of time, and so they're less worried about the house getting
Yeah,
trashed,
you
ruined.
know, they're way more likely to conceivably want to extend or want to come back.
Yeah,
And
that I
a
have a
different type of buy-in. If you're a travel nurse that wants to be in Austin, every year a certain time, like you may find a house you fall in love with and keep coming back.
yeah. Yeah, do you have data around how often people extend? I think that's one of the interesting, because we are,
I saw a handful of things in here around, do you have real bookings data? Do you have stats you can help with? The short answer is, not like if we were Vrbo or Airbnb, because we're not a booking platform. And so we have products, we have a lease product that, a lot of our landlords use that helps us understand extensions and helps us understand lease up periods. We have a payments product with Stripe. And so we are going to get better at publishing data so people understand and making the site more discoverable so that people can do the, hey, how would this work? And is it a good strategy? Or explore partnerships with the players like Price Labs or AirDNA or whoever to just help people think through this. Because it's daunting. And to some extent, you're, taking a risk and figuring out if I don't accept bookings and hope this works, how do I get more confidence? Like everything, there is risk, but we're very confident that it works. On the point around an extensions, a little more anecdotal, but my understanding is it's about a third of all of these extend. And if you think about, nursing use cases often extend, remodel, move, relocate, almost always extend. Corporate very likely extends. Construction very likely extends. Academic, not so much. Digital nomad, a little more, not so much. But it's more built into the default than it is oh, what a pleasant surprise. Like you just want to be open to it every time.
totally. Yeah, it's like, at the end of the day, we own assets, real assets, real estate. And I think a lot of people, when I talk to people anecdotally, it seems like they really think long term or short term. It's like I'm either doing a 12-month lease with this property or we're setting up as a short-term rental. And it's been interesting. As you pointed out, there's been a lot of growth in on the tenant side, just people looking for monthly rentals. And there's a lot of people who, have computer jobs like me, honestly, where it's like you can do your job effectively. And we have employees also we have one employee who just terminated their 12-month lease, and they're now working, product manager for us is now working at different spots all over the country. So it's a super exciting category. And I think Furnish Finder, you guys are doing a good job as the market leader and offering really strong economics with just a listing fee versus the take rate. One thing I wanted to make sure people had a chance to see is that the Furnish Finder team is offering $30 off the listing fee for Minoan customers for new listings. And so if you're curious, interested, highly recommend you taking advantage of that. The code is on the screen here.
And Mark, I saw a handful of things that came through in the comments I can chat about.
Yeah.
Reminder to people, a couple of the questions were, is it request to book or booking platform? It's request to book.
Mm.
It's all inquiries and request to book, and then you figure out if you're going to rent to them or not. A couple of people asked about pricing. It's $179 a year, or with this, $149 a year. And we will, look to offer a broader portfolio of products as we go through. I think, when I joined HomeAway in 2010, the lowest subscription price was like $349 a year. I think the last time Vrbo was $179 a year was like 2002. I think this is a screaming deal. I expect the 179 might be 199, but it's not we're basically trying to build the leanest company possible to go get the most landlords and tenants possible. And we've had to take a little bit of price, but we think we are such an incredible value for the price we have. And then the last one, I saw some questions about turbo tenant, going international, things like that. We will eventually offer international. Our site was built very hard coded with USD and English only. And so as we rebuild it, we're going to open up new currencies and languages. We'll probably start in Canada and offer Canadian dollars, French Canadian, and Canadian variant of English. And then we'll see where it goes from there. But the US is, there's so much opportunity. Like that's going to be the focus. And on the software integration side, as we replatform, we want to make this available and make it easier. We're just not all the way there yet.
Perfect. Thanks, Jeff. Lots of good questions. Uh, Jeff speaking at the MTR Summit, which is next week, I found out. So a little,
Next week in
so
San Diego.
hopefully some of you will be there. If not, maybe there's an opportunity to get that recording. And then also, I think, Furnish Finder's putting out a lot of good content on the industry. And so it's good to just follow them. If you're interested in learning more, signing up for an account. And then we are also, I believe, doing a webinar with Furnish Finder down the road to get a little bit more into the details on the furnishing side and how you should really think about from scratch furnishing. If you think about your customer base, you think about the intended purpose, making sure that you're covering off on everything. And we have some checklists and stuff we'll be sharing. As
What just from the Wayback Machine at Vrbo, one thing on like Mark, your surprise and delight, a weirdly correlated thing with performance was always like the knife block and the brand of knives in the block, because if you care, you really care. And if you don't, it's not that much more expensive. And a really overlooked thing for a positive review was sharpen the knives.
Mm.
You can have a cleaner spend 2 minutes and then somebody's wowed by you've got good knives in a way that's really impactful.
That is, we talked a lot about cleaners and there are different strategies. Some people, one thing that I know Jen and Taylor have mentioned on our team is sometimes they send the cleaner even just to check in on the property. It's like a nice way to send in like someone to just keep an eye on things and make it look good. But also you can do those little things that just deliver, sharpen the knives, do the little things that make sure it's consistently a great experience. So good tips all around. Well, thanks everyone for joining. We have the recording. We'll be sharing that out. The code is on the screen. And if there are any questions that we didn't answer that you really want to get an answer to, you can email us and we'll try and make sure we get you the information you need.
Thank
Thanks,
you,
everybody.
everyone. Have a great one.
Yeah. Have a great rest of your day. Bye.